Okay, hi and welcome back. And what we're going to be looking at now is just carrying on the developmental psychology, looking at some of the issues regarding moral development. We'll look at some of Erikson's work. We'll look at Kohlberg, parenting styles, and then go into the old age and death and dying and stages and development of how that happens. So we're almost there. We're getting done. We're almost through this particular chapter, so bear in mind we're just keeping on going, and so let's keep going and keep focused. All right, here we go. So when we look at socialization and social relationships, Erikson did a theory on psychosocial development. Now, socialization is the process of learning socially acceptable behaviors and attitudes and values, and this is how, as parents, we raise our children. We socialize them into how it is to be a good kid in our family, in our community, in our country. Erikson's theory of psychosocial development, individuals progress through 8 psychosocial stages. Each one is defined by a conflict involving the individual's relationship with a social environment. Each must be satisfactorily you must get through each one satisfactorily for health development to occur. The stages are named for a series of alternative basic attitudes. Adult personality foundations are laid in the 4 childhood stages. So when we begin with Erikson's, it begins at birth to first year. It's about trust versus mistrust. This depends on the degree and regularity of care, love, and affection they receive from the mother or primary caregiver. The basic trust is the cornerstone of a healthy personality. So children who cry, who get cared for, build trust. Now, we have to bear in mind that, there's a balance between, caring every time they cry and recognizing when they need something and when part of it is just exercising lungs. And so there's a variety of, delicate balances that parents experience to balance between providing good, trusting relationships or ignoring all crying and sort of leaving the child to care for themselves where they build distrust. Autonomy versus shame and doubt. This is in the first 1 to 3 years. Children will demonstrate independence by saying no. There's physical and mental abilities being developed during this period of time. It's a sign of being more independent. Initiative versus guilt. 3 to 6 years old. This is where they initiate more activities, they plan tasks, they develop motor skills, become stronger ability in that. And then industry and inferiority is happening between ages 6 and 11, where children begin to enjoy and take pride in their accomplishments. A sense of inferiority develops if a child is rebuffed by parents and teachers on a regular basis. So, you try to develop this sense of industry. And then if you carry on onto the next slide, you'll see that it carries on from age 11 to 22. We have what's called identity versus role confusion. And here, the identity crisis is more around in our teens, that we should be led as teens to the idea of how they should fit into the adult world. And this is a trial and error to figure out, if you will, spread their wings to figure out where they fit in. A healthy identity leads to the next stage. Now, from 22 to 40, roughly, these are ballpark roughs, but intimacy versus isolation. The stronger our healthy and healthier our identity, it leads to finding a life partner or acceptance of single life. To be happy on our own or to be finding somebody who is someone we can be happy with is an important element about developing intimacy. And if you recall, of course, those of you in the sociology class will recall that this first developmental task is intimacy, and part of that is having a good sense of who you are to be able to find happiness and intimacy with somebody else. Now, moving on to the next stage is between 40 and 65, generativity and stagnation. This is between 40 and 65. This is the desire to guide the next generation via parenting, teaching, and mentoring. It's taking a step out of your own self and putting your needs second and seeing what you can do to push other people forward and mentor them. And then lastly is 65 and over, ego, integrity versus despair. The acceptance that one's life in preparation for feeling, that facing death and being prepared, rather than, feeling there's so much more to do and I haven't done enough, and being in despair at the prospect that you've come towards the end of your life. Now, what we're going to touch on here is issues of attachment. In terms of our development as children, we develop attachments with our family, and there are strategies, if you will, patterns for attachment. And we find that parents are the first bond of social relationships for newborns' experience, and human newborns are one of the most helpless, dependent of all animal species. But what it is that promotes this bond is the attachment between child and caretaker. You'll see the little segment on Harry Harlow's Rhesus Monkeys in page 97-98. Looking at these patterns, what we want to touch base on is this chart you see is secure, avoidant, resistant, and disorganized. And when you can see the prevalence and the description. So just bear aware that this has a huge impact on how children develop based on how they feel attached or not attached to their parents. A secure attachment, infants show distress of separation from the mother and happiness when the mother returns. Uses the mother as a safe base for exploration. It's secure insofar as they provide them with that trust and safety. And when they're not there, they can cope, but they miss them in that first contact. Now, these are typically associated with the mother, now you've noticed. The father-child relationship can be as responsive as mothers. Attachment can be just as strong, many enduring positive influences on children. Children who regularly interact with their fathers tend to have higher IQs, do better in social relationships, cope with frustration better, they persist longer in solving problems, they're less impulsive. It just seems to support the notion that intact families are certainly much better for children, or the other way to look at it is that families going through divorce have more impact on children than maybe the parents realized while they go through divorce. Ideally, children need both mother and a father's influence. It doesn't mean that parents can't go through separation. It just means mom and dads need to recognize that being parents is always something they're going to be, even though they go through a divorce. Now, some of the parenting styles can go on this, you may have heard this process of learning about acceptance and control on parenting styles: authoritative, authoritarian, permissive, and neglecting. The process of learning socially acceptable behaviors, attitudes, and values. Children of warm, affectionate parents are more likely to be socially accomplished adults, mentally healthy, coping adequately, and psychosocially mature at work, relationships, and generativity. So permissive parenting would be making very few rules or very few demands. They don't enforce rules when they are made. They allow children to make their own decisions and control their own behavior. Children of permissive parents are immature, impulsive, and dependent, least self-controlled and self-reliant. Parenting styles are indifferent, they're unconcerned, they're uninvolved, associated with drinking problems, promiscuous sex, delinquent behavior, and poor school performance. Adolescents with permissive parents are more likely to use alcohol and drugs, to have conduct problems, and less likely to be engaged in school. Authoritarian parents, they make arbitrary rules, expect unquestionable obedience from children, punish transgressions, often physically, value obedience to authority. Parents tend to be uncommunicative, unresponsive, and distant. Preschool children tend to be withdrawn, anxious, or unhappy, and adolescents with authoritarian parents are more likely to have psychological distress and be less self-reliant and self-confident. Now, authoritative parents, they set high but realistic standards. They reason with children, enforce limits, encourage open communication and independence. They're willing to discuss rules and supply rationales for them, and are generally warm, nurturant, supportive, and responsive, and show respect for their children and their opinions. Children are more mature, happy, self-reliant, self-controlled, assertive, socially competent, and responsible. Authoritative parents are associated with middle children and teens who have higher academic performance, independence, higher self-esteem, and internalized moral standards. The neglecting parent, I think it's pretty clear, a low on acceptance and low on control, and the problems for children are pretty significant on neglecting parents. Now, one of the other influences, and it's a significant one, but it's often overlooked, is the role of peers. Friends can be a vital source of emotional support and approval. Adolescents try out different roles and observe reactions with peers, provide a standard of comparison for evaluating their own attitudes and development of social skills. Received reinforcement for undesired behaviors in some cases, associating with peers using tobacco, alcohol, and other substances increases the odds teens will adopt the same behavior. Some parents' approaches are adapted to a teenager's behavior and their peer associates. Their influence can be counteract negative effects. Peer influences render parenting more complex, but does not generally outweigh the effects of good parenting. Peer relations. At 6 months, infants look at each other, touch and smile, and vocalize towards other infants. At age 3 to 4, friendships begin, early relationships based on peer activities. By middle school, friendships are based on mutual trust. Peer groups, composed of the same race, sex, and social class, model dress and behavior, punishment for deviant behavior. Measure to weigh out traits and abilities. Learn to get along with age mates. Physical attractiveness becomes an issue, major factor in peer acceptance. Negative traits associated with unattractiveness, low acceptance by peers as a predictor of late mental health problems. Now, jumping into Kohlberg, created what he calls a moral reasoning stages. He studied moral development by presenting a series of moral dilemmas, more interested in the reasons for participants' responses than whether the behavior was judged as right or wrong. Classified moral behavior into 3 levels. Each level has 2 stages. And people progress from one stage at a time. The first stage, or the first level, is pre-conventional. Here, moral reasoning is based on the physical consequences of an act. Reasoning and actions governed by a standard of others and not internalized standards. So stage 1 would be right, is whatever avoids punishment. So it's a very simplified version of what is right. If it avoids punishment, it's right. So it's a very broad definition. Whereas stage 2, right is whatever is rewarded. It benefits the individual or results in a favor of being returned. So it's a little bit more refined. It's right is what's being reinforced and what's being rewarded. The second level is conventional. Individuals have an internal standards of others. Right and wrong are based on the internalized standard. That's what goes on inside of you. Right is whatever helps or is approved by others. Right is whatever is consistent with the laws of society. So stage 3 is called the good boy, nice girl orientation. Good behavior is that which pleases others, helps others, and is approved by others. Whereas stage 4, this orientation is about orientation towards authority. Right is doing one's duty, respecting the authority, maintaining social order. Now you can start to imagine now that the moral reasoning is getting bigger in terms of it's not just about you and your immediate needs, it's also about those people around you and your role in it, your place in it. And then the third level is post-conventional. Here individuals weigh moral alternatives. They realize the law may conflict with basic human rights. And so right is whatever furthers basic human rights. It requires an ability to think at Piaget's stage of formal operations. So stage 5 believes the laws are formulated to protect both society and the individuals, and laws should be changed if they fail to do so. Whereas stage 6 is the ethical decision based on universal principles. Respect for human life, justice, equality, and dignity. Believing following conscience may require violations of law. And so you see with Kohlberg's levels of moral reasoning, they get a bigger and bigger appreciation of morality outside of yourself to include all of society and in fact all of humanity. So when we think about the development of moral reasoning, discussions of moral dilemmas does not reliably improve behavior. Directing teaching of moral values is necessary. General cognitive development strongly influences how children respond to moral teaching. Young children's ability to infer moral messages is strongly linked with reading comprehension skills. Parents who read moral stories to children like Little Red Hen should provide explicit information about the moral message and how it relates to characters in the story. Kohlberg's stages of development occur in all cultures. Gilligan, which is another researcher, he says that there's a sexual bias. Research did not include women in his study, in Kohlberg's study, nor did it include mercy, compassion, love, or concern for others. Content of moral reasoning differs between the sexes, but does not differ in the complexity of moral reasoning. So he felt that there was a bias in the moral reasoning stages and development and levels by Kohlberg. So some special concerns in later adulthood. Well, good cognitive functioning is helped by a higher education level. So the more education we have, the better we are in our later life. Complex work environment, so the more things that we do. Long marriage to an intelligent spouse is very positive for our longevity and health. Higher income, of course, would make sense. Leading intellectually stimulating and mentally active lives. Use it or you'll lose it is a very apropos statement for getting older, that if you don't use your physical brain, if you don't use your creativity, if you don't use your social capacity, you will lose it. And then lastly, looking at death and dying. And this is something everybody will experience at some point in their lives, at least in the way that the world is divided up and set up right now. Who knows, maybe down the road and sometime in the future we won't die. But until then, death and dying is something that we need to learn to accept the inevitable, that death is a developmental task for every elderly person. Now there are stages of grieving, and this is put out by Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. The first stage is usually denial, shock and disbelief. This is not right. I've got more things to do. And then anger. Why me? Why them? Anger, resentment, and envy. Getting pissed off that you're not well, or if somebody else in your life that you care about is dying. Getting angry about why them. They're not, they're too good to die now. And then the third stage would be that of bargaining. Often with God or a spiritual guide, striking a deal to postpone death, that if you give me this strength, this time, this extra couple of weeks, I promise, and whatever you promise to do. And then fourthly, depression or sadness. Sadness over the past and impending loss. The recognition that death is going to happen and coming to terms with that, which is the fourth, which is acceptance. Struggling against death ends. Contemplating it contemplating its coming without fear or despair. And then bereavement, which is the period of grief following death, can linger on afterwards. Outspoken grievers do not end grief more quickly. Dual processing coping, that is, periods of grieving and periods of relief, can be an effective means of coping with loss of a loved one. Well, there we are. We're through developmental psychology. Now, as you can see, it's a pretty comprehensive and big topic. But that's part of what is important about psychology. It's a very, very complex and very big area of research or study. You can take so many different avenues down, so many different paths. Well, I hope you've enjoyed it. So good luck and keep up the good work. Bye now.